Hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Stensrud, and today we are going to be talking about the effectiveness of the second step as an intervention for disruptive and off-task behaviors. What we'll be going through today, the agenda we'll go through the introduction of the second step, as well as the research questions, and then discuss the methods and the results of the second step implementation. Then we'll also talk about the discussion and have questions for the end, at the end if there's any questions. So the second step is typically been used as a classroom-wide curriculum for social emotional learning, but during this study, the second step is being implemented as a tier 2 intervention in a one-to-one setting. So a one-to-one setting with the interventionist as well with the student participant. The second step has been shown to reduce disruptive and off-task behaviors, and it's also shown an increase in relationships and social problem-solving skills. As you can see, the following are the basic skills or the basic steps in implementing the second step. First, the teachers and interventionists are trained in the second step. We'll talk more about that later and what that looks like. But they are trained in the second step, as well as the daily report cards, which we'll also talk about later as well. After that, there's a miniature DESA completed by the teachers for participants. The participants were selected from their slower scores in this DESA that showed a deficit in social emotional learning, as well as by nomination of the teachers from sendouts and different problematic behaviors that they have seen. After the DESA is completed and the nominations of the teachers, the baseline data is then collected by the teachers on predetermined goals. We'll talk about what those predetermined goals are later, but there are 4 predetermined goals in which the baseline data is collected for a minimum of 5 days. Participants are pulled into a small group after that baseline has been determined, and we have had 5 consecutive stable baseline trends. We will then put that participant into a one-to-one 30-minute intervention using the second step with the interventionist. And each lesson starts off with a 5-minute review of the lesson. And it reviews the social skills that were taught to the lesson prior that the interventionist and the participant had earlier in a prior day. After the review, the interventionist introduces and reads a 10-minute short story, or there's a short film. During the curriculum, there's one or the other, and this short story or short film consists of a social situation that occurs. And there are 5 main sections that the second step's short stories and discussions focus on, which are empathy, emotional management, friendship skills, and problem-solving skills. After the interventionist reads the short story, the group has a 5-minute discussion about the story and about what particular social skills that were being taught during the story, what replacement behaviors or what students could, or the students in the story could have done instead of the reaction they had in the story. After that, then, before wrapping the last lesson up, the participants and the interventionists will have a role play or a game that's related to the social skills that was taught during that lesson of the day. And the role plays can be things that are geared towards those social skills, those particular skills that you were working for through that day, to kind of get the students to act them out and learn them that way as well too. So there has been an increase in social emotional related problematic behaviors across schools. Teachers typically do not get a great deal of de-escalation strategies or coping strategies, or how to teach social emotional skills to students who have deficits in the social emotional learning. With this, this then leads to an increase in the problematic behaviors in the schools, and particularly in students who have those deficits, which is why the second step intervention is so vital in implementing in schools today. The second step teaches and incorporates both social skills as well as relationship building skills and pro-social skills. So things that we want to see from our students in the social emotional field. As stated previously, this study was implemented as a second step as a tier 2 intervention, which there has been less research on the second step being used as a tier 2 intervention. The most research is done using it as a classroom-wide intervention, as we discussed about earlier. But this current study examines the effects of the second step for students with social emotional deficits in a one-to-one setting, instead of a whole group setting. It really focuses in on that individual, that participant that really has some severe deficits that kind of needs that extra support to build those deficits and get taught those deficits, or those skills, I'm sorry. The dependent variable is the score on the daily report card. So the teachers will track students' off-task and disruptive behaviors using the 4 goals. And these are the 4 goals I spoke about on the previous slide. They are: I stayed in my area, I am respectful to my peers and staff, I followed directions, and I stayed on my task. So the research questions were, or are, will the second step reduce disruptive and off-task behaviors? And also, will the second step increase student relationships? So as you guys can see, as far as in the settings, this study did take place in a pre-K through 8th grade charter school in the inner city of Minneapolis, Minnesota. The students remained in their general education during their class time and throughout the entire day, except for when being pulled into a small group for the 30-minute social emotional lesson using the second step. There were 2 male students in the 2nd grade who received this intervention, which were Sam, a 7-year-old Caucasian male, and Dion, an 8-year-old African American male. There was also 2 female students in the 4th grade who received the intervention of the second step as well. This was Nicole, who was a 10-year-old African American female, and Lisa, who was a 9-year-old African American female. The common behaviors that we were seeing from these students were behaviors such as defiance, or being out of their seats or out of place without permission, verbal aggression, or that verbal aggression could then sometimes lead into some physical aggression as well. There were two teachers also who were trained and assisted in data collection for the participants and received training on the second step. Those 2 teachers were the 2nd grade teacher that was in Sam and Dion's room, and the 4th grade teacher as well. The training, each teacher received that training, and the training was on what the second step is, what the goals are behind it, as well as how to use a daily report card for data collection and seeing the improvement of the scholars throughout the implementation. The teachers were put in this training for 1 day, and it was a 3-hour training. And these teachers were selected due to the fact that the students who were selected as participants and displaying the disruptive behaviors were in their classrooms. So the research design that was used was a single study, multiple baseline across individuals. Teachers and the interventionists all received training on how to implement the second step, as well as how to correctly fill out the daily report card, as we talked about. The teachers will track students off task and disruptive behaviors by tracking those 4 goals that we talked about, the goals of I stayed in my area, I'm respectful to peers and staff, I followed directions, and I focused on my task. During those goals, the students can receive a score from 0 to 2 for each goal during each subject. The way that works is if a student is meeting that goal, if they're following directions 100% or with 1 or less reminder throughout that subject, they receive a 2, or the highest score for that subject in that particular goal. If a student did have to receive up to 3 reminders or met the goal 50% of the time of that subject, they received a 1. If they received 4 or more reminders or redirections about that particular goal, then they received a 0 for that goal for that subject. There is a form in which we will look at after on the next slide that will show you what the daily report card looks like. Once a participant reached 5 consecutive days of achieving a score on the daily report card of 60 to 64 during the implementation of the second step, this then triggered where the interventionist would start the intervention, the second step, with the next participant. So after participant 1 has met 5 consecutive days of meeting the achieved goal of 60 to 64 points on the daily report card for each day, then participant 2 will be moved into the intervention and receive the second step as well, and so forth for participant 3 and participant 4. Here is a picture of the daily report card that is used. There is a on the bottom there is also kind of got cut off here. I apologize, but on the bottom there is the total goal that you are looking for and points possible. And as you can see, it has the 4 goal areas on top, followed by each subject on the side, and they can receive 0 to 2 points in each box, or each subject for each goal. As we could see, we're going to look through some graphs, but participant 1 achieved the goal, which was 60 to 64 points after 10 days of implementing the second step. The goal was possible to do it 5 days consecutively. This participant needed to do a second round before meeting that 5 consecutive days of meeting that goal, 60 to 64. Participant 2 and participant 3 each met their goal of 60 to 64 points within their first 5 days of intervention. They met their first 5 days were met with consecutive points of 60 to 64, and then participant 4 was similar to participant 1, who had achieved the goal after 10 days of interventions, or 2 weeks. As we can see in the graph for participant 1, the baseline is pretty stable, and there's very little variability throughout the baseline here. There's 5 days of baseline collected, and it starts at 48, and the baseline data points for the daily report cards fluctuates between 48 and 52 during the baseline. Now, as we move into the intervention phase, we saw that if you remember correctly, participant 1 did not meet that goal of 60 to 64 for 5 consecutive days in the first 5 days of the intervention. So as you can see, those first 5 data points in the intervention, participant 1 fell below our goal of 60. After that, you could see then a stable trend of fluctuating between 60 to 64 for the following days after the first week. So they did have a stable trend after that first week of the implementation, and they remained meeting their goal of 60 to 64 points throughout the rest of that intervention. As we go ahead, and there was 100% of non-overlapping data as well, which we will discuss here after we look at these graphs. But here's participant 2, who had 10 days of baseline data, and the baseline data similar, had little variability, and was very, very stable throughout the baseline. It started at 46 and 46 daily report card points, and it fluctuated between 46 and 52, but stayed relatively in the same area throughout that entire 10-day baseline. As we saw the intervention, we did see this scholar, this student, go straight into meeting 60 to 64 points right away from their first day of intervention, and that remained stable throughout the entire intervention. They stayed in between 60 to 64 points on their daily report cards every single day. So they were very, very stable, and had a very stable trend there. Participant 3 was very similar during the intervention. During the intervention, they reached their goal between 60 to 64 points on the daily report cards from the first day, and they continued that on consecutively throughout the whole entire intervention after the intervention was implemented. As you can see during the baseline, it fluctuated a little bit in the beginning, going from about 54 to 46 points and going up and down pretty consistently the first 5 days. So we continued to take data, and it did end up stabling out, and you can see the trend then did have very little fluctuation in between data points and remained around that 45 to 50 point throughout the baseline. For participant 4, if you can see with the baseline data, it was very, very stable, as it started around 48 and fluctuated between 39 and 48. I'm sorry, it started at 44 and fluctuated between 39 and 48 throughout the baseline. It was very stable throughout the majority of the baseline, though. As you can see, the data points were just fluctuating a couple points here and there, and the way that the daily report cards were graded, losing a couple points here or there in a subject still met them could meet them at their goal. So we did move into the intervention. As you can see, the first 5 days they did not meet their goal of 60 to 64 data points on their daily report cards. They fell well below that in the 50s, but after the second week implementation, they then stabled out, receiving 60 to 64 points in between every intervention, or after the intervention every day. As you can see with all those graphs, there was no overlapping data for 100% of those graphs. There was some data where possibly they didn't, participant 1 and 4 didn't meet the desired goal of 60 to 64 during their first intervention, but it didn't overlap with the baseline data. Their daily report card scores were still higher during that time of the intervention than during the baseline. So the second step, as we go over our questions, our research questions, the discussion is the second step did reduce disruptive and off-task behaviors in participants who received the intervention. And it also did have a positive increase on peer relationships for the participants. That was seen through the data as far as the daily report cards and as far as the partial observation method that was used as well, which was taken for one time a week for 15 minutes, where there was a 10-second intervals of trying to track data for any disruptive or off-task behaviors that fell in those 4 categories of our predetermined goals. Some connections to previous research were that it coincided by utilizing the same curriculum. It utilized the elementary-based second step curriculum, and it was incentive-based as well, which coincided with other researches. But there was a couple differences, such as instead of using it as a classroom-wide intervention, it was used as a one-to-one intervention. And also there was daily report cards used during the school day to track data, as well as use it as an incentive piece for goals at the end of the day for the checkout. The social validity was very strong throughout this second step implementation. The survey had a rating scale that was numbered for 1 through 3 for the social validity. 1 was I disapprove, 2 was neutral, and 3 was approve. And for each section, there would be a number for this. And the sections were in fairness, age appropriateness, and feasibility. And this was in order to obtain feedback from the participants, teachers, as well as students about the social validity of the intervention and how it went. And the second grade teacher, Miss Hester, and her 2 students all rated the second step a 3 out of 3 on fairness, age appropriateness, and feasibility. Miss Anderson who was the 4th grade teacher, rated the fairness and age appropriateness a 3 out of 3 as well, but as you can see, did rate the feasibility a 2 out of 3. The intervention was approved by all student participants, as they all rated the age appropriateness and feasibility a 3 out of 3. All 4 participants rated those 2 sections a 3 out of 3. They strongly approved of it. But Sam and Nicole rated fairness a 3 out of 3, while Dion and Lisa only rated that fairness a 2 out of 3. So that's where the little difference was in the students. But all 4 participants scored 90% or more on their behavioral goals, which was the goal, between 60 to 64 points on their daily report cards. And during the teacher post-intervention interviews, teachers stated that they saw an increase in pro-social behaviors and a decrease in disruptive or off-task behaviors throughout the school day and class day, as the participants were in the intervention. And the longer in the intervention, the more success they saw. There were some limitations in this study, such as teachers' variables weren't considered. As far as the 2 teachers that were selected, there was not variables such as how many years they've been teaching or prior training or their age or things like that, which were considered for them being the teachers. There's also a small sample size, which limits the generalization, and only having that 1 period of instruction for 15 minutes of the partial interview data collection was also a limitation. So for future directions or implications, I would suggest research on students with disabilities, as these 4 participants were not diagnosed with a disability, as well as research with a small group instead of one-to-one, kind of having a couple more participants involved instead of having it just be a one-to-one intervention. And here are my references.